the interesting thing about this picture is that you would probably call all of these people Mr. Lincoln's friends. Probably you would call all of them people who voted for him too, except that who could not vote in 1860? Women could not vote. Who else? African Americans, right. So for the most part, only white men over the age of 21 could vote. And there are a lot of them in this picture. But there are dozens of women. There are dozens of African Americans. There are even a few kids in here. And there's even a dog in the window of the Lincoln's home on the upstairs. It's really hard to tell, but he's in there. He couldn't vote. So we don't know the names of too many of the people directly in this picture. It's too small. But we do know the names of several of the African Americans that Lincoln knew here in town. Jamison Jenkins was one. He lived about 4 or 5 doors down from the Lincolns. And it is thought these days that he was involved with the Underground Railroad movement here in Springfield, helping slaves escaping from Missouri or Kentucky get farther north, either to Chicago, which was sort of a safe place to be a runaway slave, but a lot of them went on to Canada, where it was mostly safe to be. Another woman who's probably in this picture is named Ruth and Burns. She was an African American who came to Illinois from Kentucky and for a little while took care of the Lincoln kids as well as some neighbors' kids too. Took them to Sunday school on Sunday mornings, took them to church or the store or whatever when their mom and dad got tired of having them around underfoot. You know, sometimes you just want to get those little kids, especially if it's your brother or sister, out of your way. So she helped with that, and years later she told stories about the Lincoln home that we wouldn't know about otherwise. And then there's also, almost certainly, a man in here named William Johnson. Yes? He's probably in here too. His name was William de Florville. His name called Billy the Barber. And Lincoln was also his lawyer sometimes, because Billy the Barber was a pretty well-off man. He owned property up in Bloomington, and a couple of times he had some legal problems with that land, and Lincoln was his lawyer, as well as his friend here in Springfield. So, and then there's another man in here named what's his first name? Gilbert Johnson, African-American man, who married the daughter of Billy the Barber. Her name was Sinette. We recently discovered their marriage license. And the interesting thing is that they were married by the very same minister who married Abraham and Mary Lincoln. So in some ways, Springfield was what you would call a racially integrated community. The same man married a white couple as married a black couple. The same people who knew Mr. Lincoln as a worker, a servant, like a barber, also knew him as an equal, as his client, as his business partner, sort of. And in other ways, it was not an integrated town. You will see that the blacks in this picture are mostly standing in groups. They're either off to the left a little bit in the front, but most of them are actually standing right up against the house. And that tells us a lot, because Lincoln was one of the people in town that they all trusted. So, there are also, by the way, the occasion here for this photo is this parade float. There are about 32 young ladies, all wearing white. This was the most popular thing to do at political parades then. Young ladies dressed in white, each one representing a state of the Union. And there were 32 states in the Union at this time, so there were 32 young ladies on the float. And at the back there, it's pretty hard to see, but there's one lady who's not on the float, and she's holding up a sign that says, "Won't you let me in, Kansas?" Who said, "Oh"? You were trying to read that? Yeah.
And you see, I saw the sign.
Yeah.
It looked like a T kind of like, is she going across?
She might be wearing a cross.
No, it says holding one, and I looked, there's a sign.
Yeah. Well, Kansas became the 33rd state right after Lincoln was elected president. So that's a little tableau, what you'd call a stage show of the nation's states, right there passing by Mr. Lincoln's house in the summer of 1860. It was a big event. Okay, I'm going to talk for about 3 more minutes, and then we'll have questions, okay? Show you some pictures, and these things will also be on the website. You'll be able to look at them more closely. This is a perfectly lovely silver-plated coffee urn. The Lincolns gave this as a wedding present to a young couple whom they knew here in Springfield. The bride was a distant cousin of Mary's, and the groom was a young lawyer that Lincoln had helped train. And when they got married, the Lincolns gave them this nice silver. It's not solid silver of the kind that Paul Revere made during the Revolution. It's silver plate, which was much cheaper. The Lincolns could not afford solid silver, but they could afford silver plate. It was a new process that looked really pretty but wasn't as expensive. And the grandchildren of that couple gave this to the museum a couple years ago. This is a campaign torch in the shape of Mr. Lincoln's famous stovepipe hat. You saw the picture of what they did for daytime campaign rallies. They paraded past his house. But at night, they would fill this thing up with oil, light a torch, light a cotton wick out of the top of it, and carry these around on tall poles in the street and have a firelight parade. You had to wear an oil slick over your shoulders in case the oil dripped on it. You didn't want it to ruin your clothing. That's before there was electricity. This is a statue of Mr. Lincoln giving his great Gettysburg address. This was carved by a man who had polio and lived in a small town near here. He lost the use of one arm when he was a kid due to polio, but he taught himself to carve just with one hand and a penknife, and he made this perfectly beautiful wooden sculpture of Lincoln giving that speech. It stands about 1.5 feet tall. That's in the museum, too. Maybe the most famous event of Lincoln's presidency now, giving the Gettysburg Address. And finally, I mentioned that Lincoln had been a little boy, teenager, taking people out into the middle of the Ohio River in his little boat and charging them a fee for that work. And the fee was 6 1/4 cents. And he once took 2 rich businessmen out into the river and onto the big boat that was going down to New Orleans, and he stood there waiting for his pay, waiting to get 12.5 cents for the 2 of them. But they each threw a 50-cent coin into the boat for him, a huge tip. And then Abraham Lincoln is the man who ended up with his face on the 50-cent note during the Civil War while he was president. So that is what we call the American dream. A kid who ended up making 50 cents from a little boat he made ends up with his face on the money that everybody in the country is using. It could happen to you too.